very superstitious. Writings on the wall, very superstitious. Letters about to fall.
Boys, we gotta approach this planting problem scientifically. Just how bad is Doris's lumbago?
The worst she's ever had. I have to push her out of bed every morning to get her to feed the pigs.
How cranky's Emily been?
Well, she's been yammering at me for 2 weeks now.
Every day?
No, it's been more like every other day.
Afraid I'll have to go along with Doris's lumbago.
Yeah, me too, Ben. Doris has ached up some of the best corn crops we've ever had in the valley.
Well, I gotta admit, Emily ain't been real soybean cranky. You better put me down for corn, too.
That almost sounds like how a lot of people vote in the voting booth, doesn't it?
Certainly does.
Yeah. Welcome back to the show. If you'd like to join the conversation, it's 519-661-3600. Some of the symptoms, people make, quote, all sorts of decisions not based on, shall we say, evidence, okay, on rational evidence and on their feelings and on Doris's lumbago or whatever, right? Isn't that create a great frustration for someone trying to, push reason and say, look, and especially in the scientific world, it's almost hard to believe that here we are in this scientific world and there is actually less understanding of science and of the principles that make things actually go, if you would,
Right.
Is that a trend because people are looking for it, because it's being taught in our schools? What's your observation?
Well, my observation is that when people limit their beliefs to ones that they can, for which there's actual physical evidence, they find that there are fewer outs. In other words, you can't cheat Mother Nature, and when the only thing you're looking at is Mother Nature, as opposed to a supreme being who says, don't worry, magically food will appear, magically you'll have a house over your head, everything will be okay, and even if you live a bad life, as long as you say you're sorry at the end, you'll live forever in bliss. We want to believe these things, often as a matter of controlling stress, and so it's intoxicating, really, to say you don't have to worry, everything's not as it seems. If
it's just to control stress, is it a bad thing then?
No,
if that's all you're doing with it? I mean,
no, not at all. Not as a personal matter. Yeah. I think, at least in terms of if you're asking me from a legal perspective or from a governmental perspective, I think people should be free to, do any number of things based on whatever beliefs they want to have. If you're asking me morally or epistemologically or metaphysically, I think, yeah, there is a problem. But that's more a question of guiding your own life than of government. Government, when beliefs about, was it the lumbago?
Yeah.
When those things start getting into governance, that's when you're in trouble. And I see that already. I think we've all seen it with, for example, the belief that, there's this widely held belief that CO2 levels are correlated strongly with temperature. And that's because there is a correlation, absolutely. And for the most part, people got that correlation out of that movie by a former vice president, Al Gore's film. Yeah. Inconvenient Truth. But the thing is that he's showing us a graph across hundreds of thousands of years, and it turns out that if you actually look at the smaller period of time, so you can actually see how the lines line up, the reverse holds true. In other words, it's actually the case that temperature precedes the CO2 levels with which they are correlated by about 800 years, and that the real mechanism is inspired by the sun that causes heating of the oceans, which over a course of 800 years leads to the release of more CO2, and
which makes sense because CO2 is the product of burning, actually, even in our bodies. Sure. When we burn our fuel and we exhale, we're exhaling CO2.
Yeah, well, I won't claim to be a scientist in that, with specific detailed knowledge of that field, but I can say that it's widely understood now. Anybody who's seen, for example, Great Global Warming Swindle, for example, we'll see a wide number of scientists explaining the data in detail and explaining how, in fact, Al Gore's, interestingly, he never says, when he shows this huge peak of CO2, he never says, and by the way, that means temperatures are going to spike up equally. You'll notice in the movie, he never graphs the temperature, and that's because he knows that the relationship is the reverse, that in fact temperature causes the CO2, not CO2 causing the temperature. And so when we see that kind of dishonesty, and he said
Well, that movie's, pardon the pun, full of it, because I picked on a number of inconsistencies in that movie.
Sure, and when people knowingly, and I'll give him the benefit of saying that he just didn't know, but I mean, he studied this stuff, he says, for many years, and how closely could he have looked at the data? I mean, my goodness, this is basic stuff, and he's got the relationship in the reverse on the very data he's talking about.
Well,
so when I see that kind of irrationality, I don't. That's no longer a matter of science. At that point, it's a matter of politics. It's a matter of wishful thinking. It's a matter of, in fact, being dishonest in the sense that you're telling people falsehoods about nature so that they'll support you in a political cause. And that is the same kind of thing that any irrationality will do.
Now, of course, I'm looking at that from the point of view of the leadership, in this case being Al Gore, what he wants followers to believe. But from the followers' point of view, some of them become true, quote, believers. And even when confronted with evidence opposite of what would be knowledge or understanding, and it's not always, I think, a matter of faith. It could be, as you said, consensus.
Sure.
A lot of people are just go with the crowd, so to speak, and how much reason is employed in that. For example, other issues that I would quickly identify that might be driven by forces other than knowledge or understanding, let us say. Of course, environmentalism, as you just brought up, and and I think in that case you see global warming as the symbol of their apocalypse.
Right.
It's almost like that's a universal pattern to religious thinking. You have to have that apocalypse. Of course, there's terrorism and so many religious wars around the world when you'd think, well, religions are supposed to be philosophies of peace, and it seems to be they're more like philosophies of pieces. And I just thought of that on the spot. And of course, we see things like pending electoral reform in Ontario, which is more based on a rule of consensus.
Oh, absolutely.
We can come back to any of these in a moment. We see what I think is this almost a religion of, quote, universality, end quote, in healthcare and education. For example, even this morning, I just heard John Tory insist that, he's going to privatize private clinics, but not allow people to pay with cash or credit cards, which to me is like, wait a minute, that's no change at all. We're still on the public system.
Right.
Of course, there's the religion of socialism, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, which I understand is not the original phrase, but that's how it has been interpreted today. That's another thing about beliefs of that nature. Even they seldom bear any resemblance to the source and have evolved over time into what people want to believe. There's faith-based education funding coming again, although we have already had it to some degree with Roman Catholic funding. And I got to tell you, even from my own point of view, having gone to both public and the Catholic school system, except for maybe 3 religion classes a week,
right,
there wasn't much difference between the two.
Sure.
Not that I perceived in terms of what was being expressed. And of course, we still have in Canada, believe it or not, censorship, both through blasphemy laws and I suppose, which would be direct, right? Like, and there's even an indirect censorship, like being denied or being labeled a denier, for example, if you don't believe in the religion of global warming. So I don't know, which of those are the biggest issues to you, or which among them would require some further?
Well, I mean, I think the main point that you sort of draw out of that, and one thing I'd like to comment on, it's sort of a shorthand to call them faiths or religions, because that's how we sort of think of them. Faith is belief in the absence of physical evidence, and so when someone believes anything in the absence of physical evidence, that does qualify as faith. But
I'll challenge you on that momentarily. But carry on.
Sure. But that's not the only way in which to come up with a decision that is non-rational or irrational. The other way to do it is to say, well, look, I'm not going to think. I'm just going to either listen to what some so-called authority tells me because he's done the work and I don't want to do the work, and I'm just going to rely on him, which is the way that most government works. And even the IPCC report, that was the technique they used. Look at, these people are they're all experts in their field. And then the other route is just plain old consensus. So in other words, well, look, the herd's going this way. There's strength in numbers. There's security in numbers. I haven't thought this through, so I'm just going to follow the crowd. How wrong can they be? And although it might work from time to time, but the problem is it's a process that takes your mind out of the equation, your independent thought out of the equation. And as soon as you take independent thought out of the equation, you may be marching off the edge of a cliff. Whereas just simply looking at a map and reading the relief marks on the map might tell you that, oh, well, that's the wrong way to march. So, as I see it, you have the category of rational thought, which is logic applied to observable physical evidence. And then you have the other kinds of decision making, which are the non-rational, or, and this isn't meant as an impolite term, but irrational forms, which usually are belief in the absence of evidence, which is faith, or belief based on consensus.
What do you think about the comment made in the very opening clip of the show where the female speaker says something to the effect that, many early beliefs and superstitions have some basis in, quote, truth, and sometimes we get a sense of something that's real before we actually, and maybe even discover that it is so, before we actually knew, according to physical evidence. To give you a personal example, okay, sure. When I started studying science and a bit of astronomy, I had no physical proof, for example, that planets revolved around other stars, okay? Yep. But I knew implicitly from just understanding what I had in front of me that had to be the case. And now, of course, my faith has proven to be my faith in that thing has proven to be an actuality. Is that something different from the kind of faith we're talking about, or is that the same thing?
I think that qualifies. Keep in mind, faith doesn't necessarily imply religion.
No, understood.
And it doesn't imply God either. It just implies belief in the absence of physical evidence. And so, but I think, I think I was going to make another point that you got me off track. It was such an interesting example. But I think that the fact that some beliefs end up being true does not mean that you should make decisions for your life on the basis. I mean, you can certainly ponder. Maybe there's life on another planet. Maybe there's life on Saturn. Maybe there's maybe
there are UFOs.
Maybe there are UFOs flying around. Maybe if I dig deep enough, I'll find gold ore in my backyard. Those are all maybes and possibilities that someone would call possibilities. But rational conduct, rational decision-making means that you treat everything as false, all propositions as false, until proven to be true with physical evidence analyzed with a strictly logical process of thought.
Is that strictly rational, or would that be more called scientific?
I don't think there's necessarily a difference there, although the scientific method implies certain procedures.
Sure.
But rational thought is certainly implied in scientific thought.
Well, after this next break, we'll come back and I'll get into some of the specific definitions. I actually went to a dictionary and an encyclopedia dealing with issues or definitions of faith and reason and consensus, and we'll discuss where we might agree and disagree on those issues. Sure. And we'll be back right after this continuing break.
I want to order my seed.
Mr. Douglas, I was just taking Fred's and Ben's order for seed. Now, how much corn can I put you down for?
Corn? I'm planting wheat.
Wheat?
Yes?
Your wife got any wheat bumps?
What are wheat bumps?
Oh, they're little knobs some folks get on their heads this time of year.
It's a good sign for planting wheat.
Well, her bumps wouldn't really count anyway. She's a city girl. She might be bumping onions for all we know.
My wife is not bumping anything.
Joe, Mr. Douglas doesn't even know what you're talking about.
No, I'm sorry I don't. Now, about my seed.
Mr. Douglas, take the advice of a man that's been farming 40 years. Don't fly in the face of Doris and Lumbago.
Your wife has lumbago? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Don't knock it. It's money in the bank.
Mr. Douglas, you see, the kind of weather that brings on Doris's lumbago seems to be the best for growing corn.
Oh.
Emily gets cranky spells.
For corn?
Soybeans.
Ain't met anybody with swole ankles, have you?
No.
Well, carrots ain't a very good crop around here anyway.
Gentlemen, I know you're all successful farmers, but there are better scientific methods of farming than basing your crops on aches and pains.
What do you base yours on?
The Department of Agriculture.
Who?
The United States Department of Agriculture.
Didn't know they had one.
Of course, in Washington.
They tell you what to plant, huh?
No, they don't do that.
What do they plant?
Oh, they're not planting anything.
Ain't got any faith in their own judgment, huh?
Believe in things that you don't